April 1945. The fields of Western Germany were silent except for the low hum of distant engines. The war was ending not with the thunder of victory, but with the exhaustion of men who had seen too much. Along a narrow road near Remagen, a column of German soldiers trudged forward, their uniforms dulled by mud and surrender, rifles hung upside down, white rags tied to the barrels. Across the field, American sentries watched from behind sandbag posts. No shots, no shouts, just gestures, hands raised, weapons lowered. The Germans had been told that capture meant starvation, humiliation, perhaps death, yet as they crossed the American line, what awaited them was food. Tin trays clattered, steam rose from metal pots. Hot stew, bread, coffee, the kind of meal most hadn't seen in weeks. Some POWs stared in disbelief. Others wept quietly as GIs handed out cigarettes. It was a strange kind of defeat, one served with warmth instead of vengeance, and this moment was only the beginning. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. The Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, was now a disjointed, starving force retreating westward under relentless Allied pressure. The Red Army closed in from the east, while American, British, and Canadian divisions pressed through the Rhineland. Entire German units were disintegrating. For many soldiers, surrender had become a question of where and to whom. The choice mattered. Stories circulated among German ranks that capture by the Soviets meant near certain death. Conversely, rumors, carefully censored by the Nazi regime, hinted that American captivity offered food, shelter, and survival. Yet German propaganda insisted the opposite, that Allied prisons were brutal, and that Anglo-American hypocrisy masked savagery. This psychological battle ran parallel to the physical one. In March 1945, after the Allies crossed the Rhine, tens of thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms. The numbers were staggering. Between April and May alone, the U.S. Army processed nearly 2 million German prisoners of war. It was the largest mass surrender in Western military history. Managing such an influx required a logistical effort comparable to fielding an army. Itself, the U.S. Army Service Forces, and the Provost Marshal General's office oversaw the system. Prisoners were first herded into temporary enclosure camps, open fields ringed with barbed wire, known as Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps. Conditions here were primitive but orderly. Rations were distributed, sanitation improvised, and identities logged. From there, POWs were transported to more permanent camps in France, Britain, and the United States. The U.S. operated over 600 POW camps across America, stretching from California to Pennsylvania. Many were built near agricultural regions to utilize prisoner labor under the Geneva Convention's Article 27, which permitted non-military work for captured soldiers. By late 1944, entire trainloads of prisoners were being shipped across the Atlantic. Guarded but not shackled, inside these camps, an unexpected reality emerged. The men who had fought under the swastika, taught that mercy was weakness, found themselves eating meals designed by U.S. Army nutritionists. They were weighed, medically inspected, and vaccinated against disease. Camp officers documented their dietary intake and caloric balance, following Red Cross standards. The irony was profound. Many POWs were healthier in American custody than they had been in Hitler's collapsing army. This humane treatment wasn't improvised. It was rooted in both policy and principle. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, committing to the fair treatment of prisoners. Beyond legal duty, there was a deeper motivation: to show moral superiority, to prove that democracy could win not only by strength, but by character. But behind this moral stance was also pragmatism. Well-fed prisoners worked more efficiently. They caused fewer disturbances, required less guard intervention, and could even become sources of intelligence. Treating POWs humanely was both a humanitarian and military strategy. Still, on the ground, reality fluctuated. Supply shortages, rapid advances, and chaotic surrenders often strained resources. Some temporary enclosures faced overcrowding and hunger. Yet when prisoners were moved to established, American-run camps, especially those on U.S. soil, the contrast was shocking. From muddy fields in Germany to clean barracks, organized cafeterias, and medical wards, the transformation was unforgettable. But to understand how this humanitarian paradox took root. We must look deeper into the American mindset, policy decisions, and logistical machinery that made it possible. For many German soldiers, the first hot meal under an American flag became a defining memory. Decades later, survivors would recall that taste, beans, bread, and coffee, as their first realization that the enemy they had been taught to hate did not mirror the cruelty of their own regime. This contrast between expectation and experience would ripple across the prisoner system, challenging years of Nazi propaganda and reshaping how these men saw the war itself. The humane treatment of German prisoners was not born from sentimentality. It emerged from structure, culture, and abundance. Unlike most nations ravaged by years of total war, the United States entered the conflict with vast industrial capacity and a domestic front largely untouched by destruction. Its farms still produced wheat and corn by the millions of tons. Its factories ran around the clock. Even at the height of combat in 1944, America's logistical backbone could feed its own forces and millions of dependents overseas. At the heart of the system was the Quartermaster Corps, the lifeline of the U.S. Army. Every calorie, blanket, and medical supply that reached a soldier or a prisoner was cataloged and distributed according to standards. American planners didn't treat prisoners as a last-minute obligation. They were built into the supply model itself. The same ships that carried ammunition across the Atlantic returned, filled with prisoners, bound for American soil. Once in the United States, responsibility shifted to the War Department's Prisoner of War Division. Commanded by Major General Archer L. Lurch, it operated under a guiding principle: that humane treatment of POWs was both a legal necessity and a weapon of psychological influence. Orders emphasized the dignity of conduct and discipline without brutality. Were instructed to maintain professionalism, not friendship, but to treat prisoners as soldiers, not criminals. The American Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, played critical roles. They inspected camps, ensured mail delivery, and verified compliance with Geneva Convention standards. POWs were allowed to write home, to receive parcels, and even to study English or mathematics in camp classrooms. In some facilities, libraries were stocked with hundreds of books, many donated by local American communities. To the German prisoners, this was disorienting. They had been told the United States was a land of chaos, racially divided, morally corrupt, ruled by Jewish financiers and weak politicians. Instead, they encountered efficiency, routine, and an almost bureaucratic kindness. The coffee was strong. The bread was fresh. The guards were young men who smoked, laughed, and treated their captives with a matter-of-fact respect. The contrast between Nazi doctrine and American practice could not have been sharper. In German-occupied territories, the Wehrmacht and SS had subjected Allied captives, especially Eastern Europeans, to starvation, forced labor, and executions. But here, on the other side of the ocean, the tables had turned completely. The moral clarity of this reversal was not lost on the prisoners. Behind the scenes, American officials understood the propaganda value. Psychological warfare units distributed leaflets over German positions, promising fair treatment and proper rations to any who surrendered to Western forces. The message was simple: you will live if you surrender to the Americans. In an army exhausted by years of attrition, that promise carried immense power. The result was strategic as much as moral. By early 1945, German soldiers on the Western Front were surrendering in entire formations. Some sought out American lines deliberately, marching westward to avoid capture by the Soviets. Many carried white flags improvised from shirts or handkerchiefs. The humane reputation of American captivity had become an invisible weapon, one that saved lives, without firing a shot. Inside the camps, daily routines reinforced this stability. Meals were standardized. A typical ration included meat, bread, vegetables, and coffee, mirroring the diet of American troops, albeit in slightly smaller portions. Medical inspections were regular. Infected wounds were treated. POWs with chronic conditions were hospitalized in Army medical centers, sometimes alongside Allied soldiers. Even leisure was organized. Prisoners built orchestras, sports teams, and small newspapers. For men conditioned to hierarchy and fear, these spaces of order and normalcy were quietly transformative. But this was not merely kindness. It was a deliberate reflection of American democracy in action. Commanders knew that their behavior toward prisoners would be studied by the world and by their own men. To mistreat captives would tarnish the very ideals they claimed to defend. By the end of the war, over 370,000 German POWs had lived in American camps. Most would return home astonished, not by the might of U.S. weapons, but by the discipline of its compassion. What they witnessed inside those fences would dismantle much of the propaganda they had been fed for years, and as those memories spread through post-war Germany, they would help reshape how a defeated nation understood both its enemies and itself. Now, to see how these encounters unfolded through the eyes of those who lived them, we shift from systems and policy to the angles, the human, tactical, and moral perspectives that defined this paradox. For most captured Germans, the first encounter with American rations was a moment of disbelief. They had expected beatings, not bread. The smell of stew in metal kitchens often silenced entire groups. Even the guards noticed it, the way hardened soldiers, once proud of their iron discipline, suddenly hesitated before accepting a spoonful. Inside the camps, food became more than sustenance. It was proof that the world they'd been shown through Nazi propaganda had collapsed. Letters home often carried coded astonishment. "We are being treated fairly," or "The enemy gives us more than we gave our own." Some POWs, accustomed to weeks of watery soup at the front, gained weight during captivity. American medical reports recorded it with clinical detachment, an average of 1.5 kilograms gained per month among healthy prisoners. Yet behind the statistics lay a deeper transformation, fear turning into confusion, then quiet respect. The mess halls became microcosms of reconciliation before peace was even signed. A meal, served without malice, had become a political act. To German soldiers raised under Nazi indoctrination, American kindness was psychologically destabilizing. The Third Reich had built its authority on the belief that compassion was weakness, that mercy diluted strength. But in the camps, this narrative began to fracture. Guards treated prisoners with procedural respect. Doctors tended to wounds without distinction between enemy and ally. Religious services were permitted. Books were distributed freely. The supposed decadent democracy functioned with precision, order, and purpose. Many POWs later described a quiet humiliation that came with this realization, not the humiliation of defeat, but of moral exposure. They had been told that Americans were manipulated by Jews and obsessed with money. Instead, they found discipline rooted in conscience, not fear. For the United States, this moral example was strategic. Every loaf of bread, every clean barrack, every fair trial reinforced an unspoken argument. Democracy works because it respects human worth. This ideological clarity did not erase wartime hatred overnight, but it planted questions that would germinate in the minds of thousands who would one day return to rebuild. Germany, beneath the morality, there was military logic. Feeding prisoners, well, was not merely generosity, it was efficiency. A malnourished, desperate population of captives could riot, escape, or spread disease. For commanders managing hundreds of thousands of POWs, stability meant survival. A full stomach was a form of control. The U.S. Army quartermaster system rationed by calculation 2,500, 3,000 calories per prisoner per day, scaled to available supplies. Each camp had a supply officer, a mess sergeant, and inspectors who logged waste. Leftovers were monitored to ensure no food was hidden or spoiled. Even coffee distribution followed schedule. By contrast, in the collapsing Reich, food supply was chaos. Railways bombed, farmland seized, civilians starving. American abundance, sustained by mechanized farming and shipping, stood as an unspoken declaration of victory. And yet, the tactical calculus didn't negate the humanity. It fused with it. Discipline without cruelty, logistics without hatred. These defined the American approach. It showed that the same efficiency that built weapons could sustain mercy. Together, these three layers, human, moral, and logistical, formed the invisible battlefield that redefined enemy perceptions, but the story doesn't end with policies or rations. There were deeper mechanisms, medical, leadership, and propaganda dynamics that amplified this quiet revolution inside the camps. Behind every tray of food and every clean barrack stood an invisible army of logisticians, medics, and administrators. The American POW system was, at its core, a logistical organism designed to absorb chaos. Supply routes stretched from Kansas wheat fields to Atlantic ports, then onward to European holding zones. Each prisoner received a numbered identity tag, an entry in medical records, and access to sanitation, latrines, delousing, vaccinations. Army physicians monitored nutrition levels with precision. Reports from 1944 and 1945 detailed vitamin content, caloric averages, and protein sources. Men suffering from dysentery, trench foot, or malnutrition were admitted to U.S. Army hospitals. In some facilities, German doctors among the prisoners were permitted to assist under American supervision, ensuring language clarity and morale. Diseases were prevented not only for compassion's sake, but because epidemics could cripple the camp system. Typhus, influenza, and lice were the silent enemies of any mass confinement. The Americans understood this with industrial clarity. Health was logistics, and logistics was discipline. Through this disciplined mercy, the U.S. demonstrated that humanity could coexist with control, a lesson not lost on the men who had once served under an ideology that saw both as contradictions. At the command level, the humane treatment of POWs reflected a deliberate, philosophical stance. From President Franklin D. Roosevelt down to field commanders, policy emphasized adherence to law as a measure of civilization. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's directives to theater commanders explicitly referenced the Geneva Convention of 1929, warning that unnecessary hardship weakens the moral authority for which we fight. Officers like Brigadier General George C. Stewart, responsible for POW operations in the European theater, viewed the camps as laboratories of discipline. Their instructions were clear: firmness without cruelty, efficiency without contempt. Guards were selected for temperament as well as training. Abuse was punishable by court-martial. Leadership also recognized the psychological dimensions of mercy. A prisoner who respected his captor became easier to manage and potentially more cooperative. Intelligence officers from the Office of Strategic Services (OSS) conducted debriefings where politeness often yielded more information than threats ever could. This professionalism contrasted sharply with German leadership culture, where obedience was absolute and compassion seen as weakness. For captured officers who witnessed Americans command through procedure rather than fear, the lesson was profound. It revealed a different form of authority, one grounded in principle, not terror. The effect on German perception was seismic. As word of humane treatment spread, entire divisions began choosing Western surrender over continued fighting or capture by the Soviets. By late April 1945, intercepted German communications mentioned the safer American captivity as a motive for retreat. In propaganda terms, the Nazi regime had lost its final weapon, fear. Inside Germany, this quiet knowledge seeped through letters and whispers. Families received postcards from sons and fathers held in America, standardized cards, stamped prisoner of war mail, describing orderly camps, good food, and humane guards. Though censored for military content, the emotional tone was unmistakable. It contradicted years of state-controlled lies. After the war, Allied interrogations confirmed that for many Germans, these reports were their first personal evidence that Nazi narratives about Allied barbarity were false. Some even credited their survival and ideological disillusionment to the experience. Meanwhile, Allied propaganda units amplified these truths intentionally. Leaflets dropped over retreating German formations read, "Lay down your arms. You will be fed. You will live." For soldiers who had not eaten properly in weeks, that was irresistible. By the war's end, the humane treatment of prisoners had become a weapon in itself, a moral offensive that struck deeper than bombs or bullets. And within this environment, several pivotal incidents would crystallize. The power of that philosophy: moments where German captives, expecting brutality, witnessed humanity instead. It began quietly, no speeches, no banners, just the clatter of mess tins in the spring of 1945 near Andernach. On the western bank of the Rhine, tens of thousands of German prisoners were confined in open fields. The war was days from ending, yet the logistics of surrender had already surpassed imagination. The U.S. Army, stretched to its limit, built temporary enclosures fenced with barbed wire and guarded by MPs who had no time for vengeance. Among the prisoners were veterans from Normandy, young Volkssturm conscripts, and officers who had once commanded hundreds. They had been told by Nazi broadcasts that Americans would starve them, that surrender meant slow death. But the first morning, GIs arrived with field kitchens. Steam rose from large olive-drab vats. Soldiers stirred beef stew thickened with potatoes and carrots. Army standard ration. The same served to U.S. troops that day. The smell drifted over the barbed wire. For many Germans, the scent of real food was unbearable. It triggered memories of home, of mothers and kitchens long destroyed by bombing. Raids on American guards formed lines, organizing distribution with brisk efficiency. Prisoners shuffled forward in silence. There was no mockery, no scorn, only a sergeant counting portions. An interpreter shouted orders in German, one at a time. Keep the line moving. Then came the sound metal spoons striking mess tins, men whispering Danke, almost ashamed to speak. That day marked a turning point in thousands of minds. What propaganda had described as a barbaric, capitalist enemy was feeding them like brothers. Similar scenes unfolded across Western Europe. At Remagen, where the famous Ludendorff Bridge had enabled the Allied crossing of the Rhine, thousands of captured Germans watched as American engineers shared rations with them between shifts of bridge repair. In Heidelberg, Army medical units treated wounded POWs alongside Allied soldiers without distinction. In the American Midwest, across the Atlantic, this philosophy became routine. Camps such as Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and Camp Swift, Texas, held thousands of German captives. Inside the mess halls, long wooden tables were lined with trays of meatloaf, vegetables, and bread. American cooks followed the same recipes used for their own troops, substituting only portion size. Prisoners organized themselves into cleanup crews, kitchen assistants, and translators. Efficiency was expected and rewarded. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, one of the largest POW sites in the U.S., inspections by the International Red Cross recorded exceptional cleanliness and order. Reports noted, prisoners are treated with respect. The diet is sufficient. Conduct is good. What made these moments climactic was not the food alone, it was the realization that moral strength could coexist with victory. A captured German lieutenant wrote in his diary, later preserved in Bundesarchiv, records we were prepared for humiliation. Instead, they offered us soup. I cannot understand such behavior. It is more powerful than hatred. For many of these men, this was their first direct exposure to the democratic ethos they had been told was corrupt and weak. They saw guards who followed rules voluntarily, officers who explained rather than screamed, and discipline maintained through respect, not terror. Even small gestures had enormous weight. In Oklahoma, prisoners were permitted to attend church services under military chaplains. In Nebraska, they played soccer against local farm teams. Farmers who employed POW labor often shared lunch at the same table, separated only by language, not hostility. Each of these interactions chipped away at the psychological architecture of Nazism. The notion that mercy was weakness began to crumble under the weight of lived experience. For soldiers who had seen villages burn and comrades executed for retreating, this calm procedural kindness was disarming beyond words, yet this transformation was not one-sided. For many American guards, especially those who had lost friends in Europe, the act of serving their enemy's food was its own test of conscience. They, too, confronted the question, what does it mean to win a war without losing your humanity? This quiet moral revolution, played out in kitchens and barracks, became one of the least celebrated, yet most decisive battles of the wars, but the revelation would not remain confined within barbed wire. Reports, letters, and testimonies carried it across oceans to the War Department, to Allied command, and eventually into German homes, desperate for truth. What began as an act of discipline soon became a message to the world that democracy could feed even those who had fought to destroy it. As spring turned to summer 1945, the Allied front transformed from battlefield to humanitarian machine. Victory was certain, yet what followed revealed a different kind of power, the moral kind that endures long after guns fall silent. Reports began to circulate within Allied command describing an unexpected phenomenon: German prisoners showing voluntary cooperation, discipline, and gratitude at levels no one predicted. American officers noticed how cleanly the camps ran, how little violence erupted among captives, how organized their routines became. The cause wasn't fear, it was respect. At Camp Butner, North Carolina, an inspection by the War Department noted that the attitude of the German prisoners reflects not despair, but order and compliance. They respond to fairness. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a local newspaper ran a short article in July 1945. The prisoners are well fed, courteous, and industrious. They have even begun to teach English to one another in the evenings. This stood in stark contrast to public expectation. Many Americans still carried the pain of Normandy, the Bulge, and the Atlantic U-boat war. Families who had lost sons sometimes resented that their killers now ate 3 meals a day in safety. Letters poured into Congress demanding stricter treatment, but the Army held its course. War Department bulletins reaffirmed that American honor was measured by conduct toward the defeated. In Washington, the Office of War Information began quietly documenting these POW conditions for future diplomatic reference. They understood that how America treated its enemies would be studied by allies and rivals alike. Internal memoranda referenced the moral dividend of the Geneva compliant system, a phrase that reflected both ethics and strategy. Meanwhile, inside the camps, something subtle was happening. Conversations. German officers debated politics under the watch of guards. Some admitted disbelief that racial segregation, which Nazi propaganda claimed was proof of U.S. chaos, existed alongside such structured humanity. A few even asked to read the U.S. Constitution, available in translated pamphlets kept in the camp libraries for younger soldiers, those raised entirely under Hitler youth ideology. The transformation was even starker. One 19-year-old conscript wrote in a diary recovered decades later, "The Americans feed us better than our officers did. They are disciplined without hatred. I am confused. Perhaps strength can exist without cruelty." In Europe, news of such conditions traveled back through the prisoner exchange system and through Swiss Red Cross channels. Families in Germany received official cards confirming their sons' captivity in the United States, sometimes accompanied by standardized lines: "In good health, receiving fair treatment." These small sentences carried immense psychological impact. They contradicted the regime's dying propaganda, which still screamed of Allied brutality. By the summer of 1945, many German civilians quietly acknowledged that life under Allied rule might mean survival, not annihilation. That realization hastened the collapse of resistance and remaining. Pockets of the Reich. American intelligence recognized this shift. In debriefings, captured officers consistently cited the humane treatment of prisoners as proof that Allied intentions were genuine. This was not just mercy. It was information warfare of the highest order. The enemy now doubted its own narrative. Even post-war observers took note. In late 1945, the International Committee of the Red Cross published a report comparing prisoner conditions across combatant nations. Its conclusion was unequivocal. In the United States, treatment of prisoners of war adhered closely to the Geneva Convention in both spirit and letter. While the document avoided moral commentary, its implications were clear. In a war defined by genocide, cruelty, and total destruction, the United States had demonstrated restraint on a massive scale, feeding, housing, and rehabilitating the very men sent to destroy it. This quiet victory reverberated through history when the first waves of German POWs were repatriated in late 1946. They carried memories more powerful than leaflets or lectures. They told families about hot meals, fair guards, organized camps, and respect. For many Germans, these stories were the first tangible experience of democracy. not through speeches or politics, but through behavior. And so, without intention, the U.S. Army had waged a campaign of re-education, one rooted not in ideology but in example. A German theologian who had been captured in France summarized it years later. We expected revenge. We found decency. That changed more minds than any bomb. By the time the last POW ships left New York Harbor bound for Bremerhaven, the legacy was already written. American kindness had done what propaganda, occupation, and leaflets could not. It had reshaped the conscience of a defeated enemy. The war in Europe was over. But the moral aftershock of how America treated its captives was just beginning to ripple outward into post-war policy, diplomacy, and the psychology of an entire generation. Next, we'll see what those ripples looked like in concrete terms, in statistics, policy outcomes, and the transformation of post-war German identity. By the autumn of 1945, the guns of Europe had fallen silent, but the logistics of peace had just begun. Across the United States, roughly 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in more than 500 camps stretching from California to Maine. It was one of the largest organized incarcerations in history, and yet remarkably, one of the most orderly. When the U.S. Army began the repatriation process, inspectors were astonished. The prisoners' physical condition was, in many cases, better than that of returning Allied troops. Malnutrition, disease, and abuse, common in Axis-run prison systems, were virtually absent here. American records show that fewer than 1% of German POW deaths occurred while in U.S. custody, and most were due to natural causes or accidents, not neglect. For many Germans, the first sight of the homeland after captivity was haunting. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were rubble. Families were scattered. Yet those who returned from America brought stories that sounded impossible. They fed us like their own. They gave us books. They treated us like men, not beasts. These weren't isolated remarks. They became a cultural undercurrent in post-war Germany. Allied occupation. Officers noticed that ex-POWs often acted as stabilizing figures in their towns. They discouraged violence, cooperated with reconstruction efforts, and quietly countered extremist whispers that still circulated. Sociologists studying this period later coined a phrase for the phenomenon, moral reversal. Men once indoctrinated into total obedience to authority had witnessed a system built on respect and rule of law, and it worked. Their first-hand experience challenged everything the Nazi state had taught them about decadent democracies. American intelligence soon recognized the opportunity. Through 1946 and 1947, selected German POWs were retained temporarily for Operation Paperclip debriefs or to assist in labor shortages on U.S. farms and factories. The Army's evaluations consistently described them as disciplined, cooperative, and remarkably civil. Meanwhile, in Europe, the situation was far more complex. Prisoners held by France, the UK, and the Soviet Union faced drastically different conditions. The Red Army's camps in Siberia and Eastern Europe saw mortality rates as high as 35–40%. French labor camps used POWs for reconstruction under punishing conditions. The contrast became an open secret among returning soldiers. If you were captured by the Americans, one German officer later said, you came home alive. These comparative realities reinforced the power of perception. The United States, without intending to, had conducted a moral diplomacy campaign, one remembered long after battle medals tarnished. In Washington, analysts noted another benefit. During captivity, German POWs had absorbed not just food and fairness but democratic culture. Camp newspapers, discussion groups, and film screenings exposed them to American civic life. When they went home, they carried fragments of that mindset into the new Federal Republic of Germany. This subtle transmission of values aligned perfectly with the emerging strategy of containment in the late 1940s. As the Cold War dawned, U.S. policymakers realized that humane treatment during wartime had produced unexpected allies in peace. Many former POWs became active participants in rebuilding Germany's democratic institutions, from local councils to police forces. Behind these geopolitical effects lay something simpler: memory. The memory of a steaming bowl of soup, of a guard sharing a cigarette, of an enemy behaving with restraint. Such memories formed a bridge between conqueror and conquered that no treaty alone could build. Still, the repatriation process wasn't without strain. Many Americans, exhausted from years of sacrifice, questioned why their tax dollars fed former enemies. Congressional hearings debated costs, and newspapers published editorials demanding the camps be closed faster. Yet even amid this pressure, the War Department refused to compromise its principles. "We will not win the peace by abandoning our values," one general declared in testimony before the Senate in 1946. By 1947, nearly all German POWs had been returned home. They stepped off ships into the ashes of their old world, carrying not hatred, but comparison, a living proof that compassion could coexist with victory. What America didn't fully realize at the time was that this experience would seed the foundations of one of its most important post-war relationships, a democratic, stable West Germany that would stand as a partner, not a rival, and the human impact of that choice, the quiet, moral strength behind mercy, would continue to unfold for decades. In the years following World War II, the story of how America treated its German prisoners faded quietly into archives and family recollections. The world was consumed by new headlines: the Iron Curtain, Korea, atomic power. Yet beneath the noise of modernity, that legacy remained, influencing military policy, international law, and even the conscience of future generations. By 1948, official U.S. Army reports had been compiled into the multi-volume Prisoner of War Administration in the United States, 1942-1946, buried. Within its technical language were moments of quiet humanity, notes about prisoner libraries, orchestras formed in camps, and correspondence with families across the Atlantic. It recorded that at the height of the war, German POWs in America received an average of 300-400 calories per day, more than some Allied civilians in wartime Britain. This wasn't excess, it was intention. Washington had known the world was watching. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a rule book. It was a mirror, reflecting how nations chose to define themselves when tested by power. And for the United States, that reflection mattered. The ethical clarity of that decision became more evident as the 1950s progressed. The Nuremberg trials had exposed the depths of Nazi brutality. In that contrast, the U.S. treatment of POWs stood as a moral counterpoint, not self-righteous, but quietly demonstrative. Military academies later studied it as a case in discipline and restraint, proof that adherence to law could coexist with military victory. Historians also began connecting dots that wartime policymakers could not have foreseen. When the Bundeswehr, the new West German army, was formed in 1955, several of its founding officers had once been U.S. POWs. They brought with them a deep understanding of democratic command, structures of subordinates allowed to question, of leadership rooted in integrity rather than fear. Interviews conducted decades later confirmed that many consciously modeled their behavior after the professionalism they had observed in American guards. The influence even extended to culture. In 1951, a small group of former POWs founded an organization in West Germany called Kameradenkreis der ehemaligen Kriegsgefangenen in den USA, the Comrades, Circle of Former Prisoners in the USA. Their gatherings weren't political. They were reunions of gratitude. They published newsletters, exchanged photographs from camp days, and, on occasion, sent letters of thanks to the very soldiers who had once guarded them. The moral resonance of this story eventually reached academic circles. By the 1970s, scholars like Arnold Kramer and Gunter Bischoff began documenting the POW experience in America through interviews, diaries, and archival research. Their findings challenged traditional narratives of post-war resentment. Instead, they revealed something astonishing. For thousands of Germans, captivity in the United States had been the first glimpse of democracy functioning in real life. One former Luftwaffe pilot summarized it best: "We learned freedom while prisoners." That is a paradox history should not forget. This quiet paradox shaped not just memories, but modern military ethics. The lessons of restraint and respect shown in the 1940s influenced American doctrine, During later conflicts, from the treatment of POWs in Korea to the Geneva reaffirmations of 1949, commanders who had served as young officers in W-2 carried forward a conviction that how a nation treats the powerless defines its character more than any victory on the battlefield. In Germany, the impact endured just as deeply. By the 1960s, as West Germany re-emerged as an industrial democracy and U.S. ally, journalists occasionally revisited the POW narrative. They interviewed men who had fought against the United States yet spoke of American kindness with disarming sincerity. Some credited that experience for softening their view of the West, paving the way for reconciliation that would have seemed impossible amid the ruins of 1945. Time has since blurred the faces, erased the camps, and silenced most of the voices. But in museum exhibits, archives, and the quiet footnotes of military history, the story endures. At a moment when vengeance could have been easy, America chose humanity instead. And that decision, though often forgotten, built a moral bridge stronger than any treaty. From that bridge, a new world began to rise, one where yesterday's enemies could stand as partners in peace. History often measures nations by the wars they win, but sometimes the truer measure lies in what they do after the victory. When the United States fed German prisoners instead of starving them, it did more than uphold a treaty. It demonstrated a principle that strength and decency are not opposites. They are twins, born of the same conviction that civilization is not suspended during war, but tested by it. In the quiet geometry of the POW camps, the mess halls, the orderly bunks, the simple act of serving a hot meal, America projected an image more powerful than any weapon. It told the world that discipline need not become cruelty, that justice could wear a human face. For the men behind the barbed wire, this realization was world-altering. They had been raised to see compassion as weakness, mercy as failure. Yet in the hands of their captors, they saw the opposite, that kindness could conquer pride more completely than bullets ever could. Many of them carried that truth home into a nation that would rebuild itself upon democratic ideals once dismissed as foreign. Their memories of food, fairness, and freedom became quiet seeds of change. Today, when historians speak of post-war reconciliation, they often credit diplomacy, economics, or strategy. But beneath those layers runs something simpler: human decency extended in a moment when no one expected it. That is the unseen legacy of the German POWs in America. A reminder that wars end not only when the shooting stops, but when mercy begins, and somewhere, in the fading light of history, that image remains. A weary soldier, once an enemy, sitting at a wooden table, eating a meal offered by the hand he once tried to kill. It is, perhaps, one of the greatest victories of them all.